I chose not to get around to this one for a long time because it's an episode that I'm never gonna outdo. Not quite in quantity, there's been Prince, but probably in quality of the music and, yeah, in fandom devotion. Like, this level of tribute might be necessary. Does it mean anything that I'm recording this on the 8th of January? No, doesn't mean anything. I am going to keep it to albums. I have no plan to include other EPs or collections. But even before the preface, there's the pre-preface that is Bowie's 60s work. Already knowing his vocation in his teen years, he just didn't yet know the genre. But that still already brings some pinging about of genres. Still imitative at this stage, and not too long later he will become a very innovative musician, and that's what we largely value him for. But he's showing some chancer chops at different kinds of 60s rock, soul, pop. It's not quite all there, but you can see reason to keep faith in him. I can advocate this collection mainly as archaeology. Competent as a performer, his skills as a songwriter show through a little bit here. It's a little bit that's worth looking at, but not ranking. See, even his first album is kind of quasi-deleted. I say, well, holding one of the many reissues of it. Retitled Anthology, whatever. I don't know whether to address this video to people who already know or not, but in 67 he was going all in on being a kind of novelty artist. And that is an all in on trying different things, theatre and mime, but songs too. I actually only just picked up this collection, it was still in cellophane. I was already familiar with the material and thought, well, it's gonna be included with a kind of shrug off. And yeah, compared to David Bowie's discography, that's still true. And yet the wit and arrangement in this is really worth your time for an occasional listen when you can brave the cringe of it and then realize it's not all that cringe. He was already making subversive songs, even gender subversive. I'm trying to focus on just the album tracks themselves, but even there, there's still Love You Till Tuesday and Silly Boy Blue. This is an impressive album and an impressive collection that just has to be dwarfed by what it's going to come up against. Then we get to the first album he'll admit to. Note that I'm largely looking at these 1999 reissues. If you care what version of an album I'm ranking, then I look forward to your comment. On an album that was later retitled after its by far most famous and first track, he presents the folk music he's gotten into and then immediately mastered. Okay, if you follow the Bowieology back to 1968, you can see it wasn't immediately mastering folk, and he attempted a few things on the way there, getting used to it. It's even possible we'll pick up more demos from that period. There was an intended album that wasn't recorded, but we're getting demo by demo every now and then. We may have got all of them now. There was an intended musical. I'm trying not to get too distracted by things that haven't come out as albums. Basically, don't let this one get overshadowed by the track that's obviously going to overshadow it. Because if Bowie stopped here, he could still go down as a kind of Nick Drake level songwriter. Later on in his career, Bowie would farm out his musicianship to his collaborators. That didn't stop him from mastering this vibe as a solo artist. Yeah, one with plenty of orchestration and decorations, and they're nearly all welcome, but the songs are even more welcome, with an expressive intensity and that particular vibe of when a young man writes songs about feeling really old. Yeah, that's the stuff. Let's not forget that one of his masterworks comes before 1970. This video's gonna be long because every album I'll basically have to explain his change to approach. Usually a little in common bleeds between the two albums and it can be quite comforting, but there'll be a new and intense vibe, and here it's the sound of a power trio. That is, the three musicians that weren't David Bowie. He turned up with just about enough time to record the vocals. It's a tighter and slightly slighter collection with just as many of Bowie's best songs. We're really in an intensely good era here. There's no excuse to not hear any of the albums of original material in this decade. Only one track isn't ambitious enough. Only one track is too ambitious. In total, it's a power pounding classic. And it's not gonna let up for a long time. Here's a set of more mellow, intellectual, private music that's still side A stage show on piano, and side B a tribute show on guitar, which makes for the most complete, ornate, and satisfying presentation of who Bowie is thus far. I can't go past Hunky Dory without noting that it's where I properly tuned into Bowie, amassing music taste when I was 12 or so. My dad got that 2-CD best of, and I hadn't much access to good music yet. Chart music was horrible, and it was somewhere around reaching the freedom and the pocket money to get 2 CDs for a tenner at Music Zone that I could expand on what I knew from this set. The obvious first protocol was where them piano singles near the start came from. Just getting something like Quicksand, a young artist with the insight to say, "Don't believe in yourself," a profound objection to the doltish platitudes of mainstream culture, the dreck of brainless positivity. Peers were into the edgy charm of nu metal or Eminem, and I didn't get much such access, but also never would have fallen for something so brutish. Instead, 30 years back, there's the dissociated torture dream of Bewley Brothers, the Homo Superior, the Wall, the god-awful Small Affair, and sure, it sits alongside simpler sentiments like "We believe in you" and "Fill your heart." Ooh, follow me on this cookie tangent. Bowie covers Biff Rose on this album, and he's not well known at all, just an American hippie whose quirks he was undertaking for a while, whose influence you can see thoroughly on this album. I'm ranking very highly because it's brilliant. I went to listen to Biff, and he doesn't reach such heights himself, but you gotta acknowledge what sprung from his own ideas unto a truly great work. Then you gotta have a look at his later work, and oh, it's cute to prop up an outsider artist, but then they get like this and their derangement becomes a lot less endearing. Then there's a concept and a much longer title than any CD publishers would admit to. Written in the same creative surge as that last piece, but now he's finally accepted that he's got to play the character. It brings a deeply impressive concept album, except for its attempt at a concept. That's the thing with the idea of concept albums, especially by 70s one album a year standards. Like, there's obviously a general sketch of what's going on here. You don't have so many songs with star in the title without having some idea that it's a star concept album, but they still cut 2 of the best contender tracks from The Running and threw in that cover, and that undermines what's nearly a perfect half hour of rock music. It's only with the benefit of retrospect that builds this album up so much that we can notice the very obvious ways in which it could be a bit better. But whatever, all the rest of the power is here, rocking out without losing its grip on the narrative and the brains and the piano ballad. It's a very welcome nighttime sibling to Hunky Dory. When I first heard of this, I assumed it was legitimately a motion picture because I wasn't yet used to the way concert films get described as documentaries or just films. And if it were a film, I'd be in no hurry to see it because it's a film, but it'd tell the story he's pretending to hint at telling. Bowie himself stumbled near to trying to bother making it a quarter century later, then didn't. And we saw how Velvet Goldmine turned out. This retelling of the album this year doesn't include Sweet Head or Rock and Roll Suicide. The story will always be messy because it was never seen through. Without bothering to rank, it's worth highlighting how important this collection of BBC recordings is. Covers the time we've got thus far, it has a few exclusive tracks that are worth your time, and it just proves that the musicianship was there before the hype. All of the contents of these discs were before the successful hype, despite that later photograph. And yeah, his music would have been amazing even if it didn't catch on. Then it's such an obvious time for a follow down that he goes and makes it better. By accepting that he's a touring, performing musician and taking in the influence of one particular northwestern continent and the pianist, this subversion of going up to 11 that's just unironically the good idea of taking things up to 11. Not just in loudness and vigor, although that part's good too, but the piano songs that let Mike Garson go wild, i.e. Mike Garson be normal. This cabaret influence is such a different direction, and yet it blends in perfectly, achieving androgyny by maxing out on both the masculine punchiness and the feminine elegance. Not that genders are real. To call this a cheeky inclusion, it was a cheeky inclusion for David Bowie. Just about having enough time to play some sessions with the remnants of his band he hadn't yet fired. A covers album that mostly goes one generation back musically, but at a time when the generational distinctions in music were vast. With all that preparation of live performance, these tracks blaze with vigor. All I can advocate on here is the brilliance of its performance, when the content itself is relatively cheap, just as intended. Then the narrative is that he abandoned that persona, but in pumping out more than one album per year, you're gonna hear each layer of clothes he strips off. You're gonna hear the mullet growing out. And you're gonna hear this odd pivot with a very particular charm to it that's doomed to not really be a success story because it had ambitions that someone was able to say no to. And when you've been high for so long, you don't quite notice the dust you're leaving on the counter, but it still gets into the music. Due to this one's intent as a concept album and how it couldn't see it through, the seams are visible as he casts off glam music and tries out his new crush. But they've made that into a chronological narrative, with a 3-part epic that really has to be heard, and a few more bits that you really should hear. Here's Bowie letting the music that was once pristine get filthy, get seedy. Then, in the slow process of becoming a young American, he picked the right fascination and it won. They could hear him, someone up there liked him, and it got him fame across the universe. I'm trying not to get too snagged on what could have been because this resultant album is still very satisfying, but it was a late-in-the-day revision, and yeah, I'm not much a fan of the track Fame, that cast off some of the best work from these sessions. I know that's arguably been restored on one of the many reissue projects. Yeah, it'd be nice to rewrite the canon, but this is how the album goes. And I've not even mentioned yet its soul music. The guitar's scratchy, the groove's funky. For the kind of reinvention that might provoke the reaction, you can't do that. And that's not like a moral judgment, we just didn't think it possible. Bowie finds a further octave to his voice and elasticity to his hips, and finds the right players to build a very strong music around that. Then this one is often mentioned as a best album if you want like muso respect. I'm not putting it there, you can't get there with only 6 tracks. Probably a bad time to mention that I'm considering doing a 6-track album. It is a pretty convincing argument when you have any of those 6 tracks on because they are each so intricately masterful. And for someone who spent this year retaining his toenails and drawing chalk patterns to stop Jimmy Page from getting revenge for fucking the same teenager, the power he accessed well off his head does bear its own distinctive peak. Just as a vibe in total, the smokiness of this one gets in my eyes a bit. It's clearly the evil side of Young Americans, which is already a bit sinister, and it's not as compulsive a listen as the works that surround it, except when you've got it on. Then the next 3 are nicknamed after some place. Is it Lowestoft? With a distinctive side A, side B format, he nicked off some German band. He goes in 2 new directions at once, this time trying not to be pretty. It brings one side of nerdy miniatures that cock an eyebrow at the very concept of music, and then it swaps to the other eyebrow for a more high-cultured, there's got to be another way to say that, deconstruction of sound. I gotta admit, and you can probably interpret that I'm not that much into ambient music, but the 4 tracks of it here really earn their time, just not as much as that awesome A-side. And again, when a new album isn't an absolute reinvention, it's at least a kind of evil twin. The vocal songs are now more stage-worthy than the bedroom-ready stuff on Low, and they're also totally insane. This one is obviously named after one of Bowie's most famous tracks, and the fame of that track can often present it without its own context. Though it still shines bright here, it might be possible to even forget it on a listen-through due to the oddball stuff that surrounds it. Still with a strategically oblique second side, this one just isn't quite as coherent, but maybe that's what's good about it. And then I've already said evil twin, but there was a mutant triplet. Yeah, you've heard of experimental albums, but how about one in which literally every song is an experiment? That does make for a couple of grating moments, and you can see that the whole project is wearing thin, but as it did so, he still found the last handful of brilliant songs in it. The way this one chooses to be ugly and aims to be nobody's favourite, hello to the commenter who'll tell me it's their favourite, is gonna dampen its rank, but this still sits atop other whole discographies. Then it gets monstrous. Considering the last three are often thrown together for the sake of a city they weren't all made in, we segment this one as something completely different, whereas it's doing quite the same thing as Lodger, presenting music as a grotesque, with a lot of overlap in musicians. It's just more successful at it. This was the bow at the end of a creative run. I don't know if it was exactly planned to be, but technically behind the scenes creativity was running on fumes at this point. The fumes of much older demos are in these songs. There's one cover track, one reiteration of a track, and nearly all the rest of it is based on Bowie's earlier ideas, even some of published ideas. Two of these epic tracks are retreads of Heroes and Golden Years. But maybe there's something in the shameless audacity to that, or maybe I just really like the sound of middle age. Yes, 33 is middle age when you're David Bowie. Check what age he died at. Your 30s are clearly middle age when you're a musician. Look how his 80s went. But here he accesses that as an eye-rolling weariness manifested as sardonic power. Bowie and his many employees, which of course in ranking the albums I'm gonna underrate the other people who contribute to his music, got so good at doing music well that he ended up doing it well, badly, well. He was really quite ahead of his time. It tops off his late 70s work by saying, here's a version of that for you. It still hates you, but you're invited to hate you too. Yes, please. Ball is good. Okay, bye. Am I gonna be one of those rockists who kinda can't stand Let's Dance? Yeah, 'cause of what it sounds like. 'Cause the music got it's less good. You don't quite immediately notice with the single shoved up at the start. And oh, should I have thrown Iggy Pop albums into this ranking? I'm not gonna, but I am gonna do Tin Machine and then I'll think I should have... It's just the first glimpse of creative laziness, of contempt for the audience developing from serving them challenging and rewarding things to just chucking generic stuff and saying this'll please them. Without quite being a disaster, without quite shedding his charm, it still boxes it up. In other words, I can't dance. Then no one can make me get a copy of Tonight by David Bowie, 'cause I know what it sounds like. Despite the promise of the tracks that make it through to compilations, the rest of it is just putrid stuff. The way too many horrible covers obviously make you wish for some original material, but a lot of the original material kind of makes you say, oh, could I go back to the horrible covers, please? The slight moments of strength in these two tracks do make you lament what maybe could have been. And really, if you hear his soundtrack stuff from that era, he wasn't entirely creatively letting up, just in the things he would present as his own products. It's one that I've wished a few times could be redeemed, but then I tried listening to it. Because the most of it is just an overwhelmingly obnoxious listen. It manages to be both easy listening and so difficult to listen to. I have to admit that the Labyrinth soundtrack has enough material on it to mention. The songs are alright, but the instrumentation isn't, and it ultimately doesn't contribute much. We're still in the dumps decade. Except not when you listen to the songs. I think this one gets readily misrepresented. It's often described as the worst David Bowie record when we've just had Tonight. And within the context of how his 80s were going, this does count as a slight return to form. Slight. Again, typically that's by picking a new path, and this is a kind of political stadium rock. It's garish, it's got big hair and too many props in the set design. But when you compare the songwriting with the last couple of albums, this actually has songwriting on it. Good songwriting? Not much. Songwriting that deserves the Bowie brand? Barely any. But when you consider the year 1987 for a musician who started out in the 60s, it's not quite bad and it could have been a lot worse. I guess if you need a defender for this album, I guess I'll come on your podcast, but then I will have to listen to it a few times, so pay me well. What I didn't like was that remastered rewrite. I know Bowie always intended that. Maybe if he'd been able to re-record the vocals, but it still took the pulse out of the songs. And yeah, the pulse was brick wall lockstep 80s drumming, but it partly has my respect. For someone who changed direction every time he took a step, it was definitely time for David to make this kind of step. Crushed by falling out of favour, he joined a leather-suited rock band. Or a kind of posh, expensive suits that all look the same rock band. Again, this is remembered mostly with embarrassment, but I think the reappraisal has been around for long enough that I don't need to defend from that. Because both of them are true, because the music doesn't quite work, because the lyrics and the performance are quite blockheaded, which is very much what they were going for. I do think a good few of the too many songs on this album are rescuable, just not by this production. Considering the sound of their self-titled debut album, it feels very appropriate that this band were named after one of the weakest metals. Being a wild yet soulless hard rock band in 1989 did prove prescient, but a prescient idea and a nickel will buy you a nickel. Saying that they could hear tomorrow coming doesn't actually improve the sound of this. Their limitations were self-imposed in compositional simplicity. Catch any clearly recorded live clips and it rips, but that's not the album's. But what does improve the sound of this is the second one. What a title. Everyone was keenly anticipating a sequel to that last album. It's published 2 years later, but it's not creatively that young. All they really had time to learn in the interim was how badly they're received without improving on how they present. And yet, a far less jammy, more consciously designed approach to songwriting guarantees better songs. +2 hunt sale songs. Here you hear Tin Machine going from being just a good idea at the stage of being only an idea, keep it only as an idea, to an actual good product, which of course ought to be the end of the line for them. And it is. His career restarts with an album that found him treat politely at best. If anything, that was the aim, a reclamation of dignity, with enough buyers to prove him still relevant, but not really claiming for the charts. Compilations keenly reduce this one to Jump, they say, which demonstrates the new sound and is obviously a good song, without having to trouble listeners with the rest of it, but I put this on and I don't want to skip anything. This step in what I get to call jazz fusion, even if it isn't, because what does fusion mean? Yeah, it's that. Actually has a pretty convenient argument for rehabilitation considering how well received Black Star was. What if this is its Daylight sibling? The use of several covers and instrumentals and one retread does have to hold it down, but it's far from embarrassing. It's a pivot that should go down as more than a tidbit in Bowie's career, and if you find the extra tracks from the time, maybe it can. But before the calendar year could end, he moved on to a release that's kind of doomed by its status as a soundtrack, but maybe it's also freed by its status as a soundtrack. Well, it better be, because it's not really a soundtrack to that BBC series. It just almost kinda was gonna be, so he kept the title. This kinda deserves its own title. It deserves better than the 2 album arts it's been given. It goes down as the private and creative uninhibited constructions of someone no longer having to construct their music to please the mainstream. That said, there's still good slices of pop on here, but done for the joy of pop rather than the pop of pop. This being creatively all over the place and kind of first draft is very much its strength. I'm trying to make this a rank the canon albums video and not pause to point out every time there was something we could have interpreted as an album if we really contrive it. And then do really contrive it, because that's the kind of thing I do, and try to rank that, and I'm very tempted with the Leon Suites. Terrible title, dazzling content, still no official release. Come on, they're clearly scooping up anything they can re-release for Bowie. They did a compilation of 90s material, and they called it that. And they didn't gather up the Leon Suites that you can find on YouTube. That's a project of unbridled creativity that Bowie and his collaborators whipped up. It was rejected and eventually had to be tamed down, but it should have at least been a bonus disc to this release. Promoters of Bowie's 90s work, which traditionally includes myself, will highlight the concept ambition of this lengthy disc, and I just can't fully commit to that. I think there's a bit too much nonsense on it. Like, this is definitely one to skip through and make a shorter mix of. Because of the epic gothic industrial songwriting that's in there, it's just in there amongst so much bloat. Why have the people who want to cancel Bowie not noticed him portraying a black character yet? The nonsensical concept in this one does undermine its content. Also undermining is that one at the start of the title. It is always embarrassing for musicians to say that something's one of a series and then never publish any of the follow-ups. I've done it myself. Here, though, the very evident weaknesses of this disc have to be taken with the evidence of its brilliance as well. It's just when you rank the albums and you get to this one, you have to consider the enormity of both. Then there's one that, if I were convinced by the concept of outside, I could easily file this as a follow down. Within the scope of that, within the setup of the one at the start of that album title, this is a cop-out, a retreat. But in the music of this creation itself on the Windows XP backdrop, it's overall more successful. He's still showing a lot of 90s influence, these tracks being dominated by very busy drum loops. It's funny how this was obviously intended as a tribute to the strength of his band's live performances, and it does come across as that, but it's so sequenced. But it's a solid presentation in a new means of creativity, and though it gets into some filler, that can still be quite thriller. I've spent my first 2 decades of online Bowie fandom defending this one, and I think I can justify that in general, but now I'm ranking the albums and I put all the albums on. It just doesn't compare enough. Because here he is surrendering to a very standard songwriting. It's an odd compromise between a video game soundtrack that was never supposed to show off his best work, and an album that ought to show off his best work, but he's not brought it. The simplistic lyrics from Bowie really don't help it, considering how it's comparatively simplistic music. We've still got Reeves blazing away. Yeah, I'm a Reeves apologist. But he's reined in by what are ultimately mediocre songs. If they called it the Omicron soundtrack, we could call it a hidden gem, but we'd still be overstating it. It's at this point that he sounds old, though technically he crossed that line as a manual decision quite a while ago. There was enough creatively going on around it that it justified the decision. Here, that's just not all there. Still, I find something uniquely comforting about the cleanliness of the sound to this one, like an antiseptic white and blue room. Now, it's the one album that doesn't count that I get to decide counts. I know this has since been officially published, and yeah, I've not got that, I've just got the bootleg I burnt myself. Wait, is that illegal? Pretend I didn't do this. But this way you don't have to see that cover art. I'm also used to a slightly different track list than what was published then. Anyway, this was at a point when Bowie decided his next turn would be away from looking forward. But at least his choice of looking back was specifically to the things that people didn't know. This album project is re-recordings of 60s material, quite thoroughly updated, almost thoroughly enough to call rewrites, although not quite. He kept it at a very nice level. Then they're very satisfying reinterpretations with the band he had with him at the time, and yet only briefly satisfying. There's not much depth to this project. It was rejected by the label, and the worthwhile original songs got upcycled, and that ultimately dooms any appraisal of this project in retrospect. Fair or not, the song Slip Away is going to score points for the next album. This was never going to be anything more than an odd project where the oddness is the lack of oddness. And it's worth a listen, just won't stack up. Heat 10 is presented as such a reclamation of power that I think we pretend it's got more than it does by getting back to his A-team, which is almost just him and Visconti, and then welcoming overdub participants. This release restores self-awareness without pushing it into insecurity. However, I think we got so used to it being near the end of his creative career that we just ignore the wasted covers and drab tracks. And there's a welcome set of highlights he can and has and will do better. Then such an obvious mild follow down that makes the songwriting more direct and performative, but it also rocks harder. With a similar enough vibe to Heathen to be called the disc 2 of it, that's how it feels. A very welcome disc 2, but one without the coherence of disc 1. Still with more political ambition and some complete stormers, it's not one to skip. Being born in 1990... Sorry. Sorry, that number always makes me cough. I didn't get to participate in the fandom of Bowie real time in any of those prior releases. And this absolutely mythical comeback rings as important to me, the same way it'll ring important to any real-time Bowie fan. But still, to me, it hadn't ever felt like a hiatus, it had felt like the end. I slightly remember a reality standee at a shop, knowing he still counted as a current thing, but feeling no urgency, not really buying things at new price, not old enough for gigs, nobody to geek out with, whatever, there's always next time. And then the next day. Maybe the decade there covers for how he's not made that much of a leap in sound, with contributors sourced from his reliable later musicians. And you can just about see the names of some of the people he stood up on the back of it. This is very much legacy Bowie. He no longer needs to reinvent, he just needs to be, because he's hella good at that too. And it's kind of a conglomeration of all of his brilliance. There's a creative confidence to this because there's a creative success to it. Still feeling like the same kind of music as those last two, it just offers an absolute bounty of it. And with a higher hit rate. That extra disc is good too, just don't make me buy stuff that way. Then we're here. The number at the top refers specifically to the day or two between the release of this one and its context being changed entirely. Because at release, this was just him getting back to reinvention. A harsh and punishing jazz music as opaque as this. This is the time when the reviewers who turn in their copy on time envy the ones who didn't. Because they got to point out quite how much death haunts this album. And though, yeah, they were right. That does also describe the Bowie discography. That's why I like it. This is kind of the perfect level of a challenge. It's pitch black, but still full of humor. It sounds tragically unanchored, a Major Tom who can no longer hear. There's something monolithic about this, and it clearly has a unique importance, but I'm ranking the albums, and these ones are better albums. Lazarus soundtrack is something you'd think might be good, but it's got a really overwrought lead singer. Should I mention non-album tracks? No, that's not what my format is. A lot of them are very good. You have to go and find them. Okay, I don't actually hope I've upset anyone. Just trying to express something honestly. Bowie's career is obviously a massive influence on my creativity, and that's true for a sheer majority of the acts that I've already covered in this series. You can't escape the importance of that blueprint for a creative career. We know its flaws, but ultimately there ain't that many. We know its strengths, and you can get lost in them for weeks. And they resound in the culture of all music since.